The child trembled in her arms, small arms wrapped tightly around her long, trembling neck, large eyes wide with the unspoken horror only the very young can truly feel when their world collapses around them. The mother clutched the child close to her breast, her fingers shaking as she whispered in broken, high-pitched whimpers not meant for any human ear. Her skin was like pale, mottled glass, veins pulsing with a strange blue bioluminescence beneath the surface, her breath ragged and desperate as she stepped closer to the ruined ship's airlock, pushing herself past the flame-licked metal land, the smoke coiling like serpents in the dead air. Outside, the last of her people were dying, burned, scattered, shredded by weapons her mind could barely comprehend, fired from ships that did not ask questions, did not hesitate, did not feel guilt. They were not hers. They were not even the ones who had fired first, but her people had been in the way, in the wrong zone, in the wrong quadrant, in the wrong story. And they were being erased, not by malice, not by monsters, but by a simple mistake, a targeting error, a communication breakdown. A war that had not meant to happen, and a strike no one could recall authorizing. Yet the death was real. The screams were real. The child was real. And now they were here, standing in a human colony's emergency bay, surrounded by red flashing lights and silence so thick it could suffocate a soul. A single figure stood before her. Tall, upright, covered in thick armor now slick with smoke. Unset, helmet retracted to reveal a pale human face streaked with ash. His rifle was lowered, not abandoned, but not pointed. Not anymore. He had expected an enemy. He had expected another desperate alien charge, a last cry of vengeance, perhaps one final suicide blast from a grieving parent. What he had not expected was the mother collapsing to her knees clicking hard against the floor with a sound like shattering ice, the child in her arms gasping out a wordless cry. He watched as she raised her long, clawed fingers, not in attack, but in pleading. She did not speak his language, not well. But her voice was tremulous, her body quivering with loss, and her next words were broken, simple, and devastating. Please, please don't leave us, you're all we have left. The man stared, unable to move. The bay lights flickered above, struggling to recover full power. The emergency shield buzzed behind him, keeping out the ashen rain of the dead atmosphere beyond. He did not lower himself. He did not speak. Not yet. But his heart began to crack, not with confusion, not with guilt, but with something older. Something more dangerous. Empathy. The alien mother bowed her head, expecting death. She had seen the humans fight, had watched from a distance, hidden in the depths of broken tunnels, holding her baby while the ground shook with explosions and the sky turned red with fire. She had seen their precision, their fury, their grace under pressure, but she had also seen something else. The way the medics screamed for more bandages when they found wounded civilians. The way one human had died trying to shield a falling alien child, not even his own species. The way some of them wept, alone in the ruins after it was over. There was something strange about them, something she did not understand. But now she was out of understanding, out of time, out of family. And this man, this soldier, was all that remained between her child and the void. Outside the walls of the base, the planet moaned. Buildings collapsed under their own weight. The crest groaned with the pressure of sudden abandonment. The final emergency pods had already launched. The last transport had left hours ago, filled with wounded and refugees, human and otherwise. Only emergency personnel and stragglers remained. And now this. An alien mother on her knees, clutching a child too weak to cry anymore, begging a stranger for something no soldier was trained to give, forgiveness. And in that flickering moment, beneath the strobe of failing lights and the weight of too many bodies already buried by time and fire, something shifted. The air felt heavy with silence, thick with the smoke of shared tragedies. He still didn't speak, but he stepped forward. One step, two, his boots echoed in the metal hall. The child turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes huge and wet, her breathing too shallow. She reached one arm out, thin fingers barely extending beyond her small wrist, and made a sound that wasn't a word but felt like one. He dropped to one knee, and for the first time since, the sirens started days ago, she let out a breath that wasn't a sob. There was no music. No voiceover, no command from above, only a choice, one human, one alien mother, one broken child, and the words, still lingering in the air, please don't leave us. You're all we have left. Asterisk, the silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Suspended over a canyon filled with the bones of broken civilizations, the soldier knelt, the weight of his armor creaking slightly as he shifted. But his eyes, those weathered human eyes, remained fixed on the child. There was something teal behind them, the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could repair. He had seen too many last stands, too many final breaths. And now, in front of him, was not another threat or combatant, but a mother who looked like she had already died inside, held upright only by instinct, and the small heartbeat curled against her chest. The child blinked slowly, each breath a flutter on the edge of fading. It didn't cry. Children cry when they expect to be saved. This one simply watched. His name was Staff Sergeant Callan Ward, United Earth Expeditionary Forces. He had been trained to assess risks with cold logic, to protect his unit, to neutralize danger. But no manual prepared him for the way the alien child's eyes seemed to reflect his own nightmares. Something deep inside him trembled, not out of fear, but recognition. Loss, raw and universal, had no language barrier. He knew that emptiness too well. He unclipped the emergency ration pack from his hip with slow, deliberate movements. The alien mother tense, her body coiled, but not to strike, only to protect. Her muscles twitched like steel cords held too long under strain. Callan laid the packet on the floor gently and pushed it forward across the metallic surface, the crinkling plastic echoing like thunder in the vast silence of the docking bay. He reached into another pouch and drew out a small med patch, tearing its seal and showing her the blinking indicator. He mimed placing it on his own arm first, pressing it firmly, and then gestured toward the child. Her eyes, black pools laced with silver filaments, flicked from his hand to her daughter's chest. There was a pause, long, shuddering, and then, very slowly, she lowered the child toward him. Her hands did not let go. Callan didn't blame her. He reached forward with infinite care, affixing the patch just below the child's fragile shoulder where he could see pale skin unmarked by scales. A gentle hiss escaped the device as it activated, releasing nanoserums designed to stabilize vital signs. They weren't calibrated for alien physiology, but it was the only chance the girl had left. The patch flickered once, twice, then turned green, weakly. The green dot the mother's knees gave way with relief. She crumpled forward, arms still locked around her child, forehead pressed to the floor. A choked sound rose from her throat, half sob, half exhale, like something ancient being exorcised from her chest. Callan didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He reached to his comms unit and flipped a private frequency open. Ward. To Central Evac Relay. I have survivors. 1 adult, 1 juvenile, non-hostile, civilian. Requesting medevac priority. Repeat, medevac priority. The answer came back through static. Negative, Sergeant. No assets available. You're outside the recovery perimeter. All evac shuttles are accounted for or rerouted. Last window closed 30 minutes ago. He closed his eyes, of course. The woman stirred, her eyes blinking slowly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Callan looked at her and shook his head once. She gasped as if struck. No, she rasped, her voice rising in panic. No, don't leave us, please. I'm not, he said quietly, though she couldn't understand the words, but she heard the resolve in them. He leaned back and activated his armor's internal systems. Power reserves low, oxygen good for 5 more hours. Environmental seals holding. There was still an old rescue crawler in the maintenance hangar, buried beneath debris. It had half a tank of fuel and a busted leg, but with some patchwork wiring and blind faith, it might limp them to the outer comms beacon, 40 miles north, where someone might still hear a call. He stood. The mother looked up at him, her long fingers clutching her child's thin wrist. He pointed at her, then at himself, then toward the heavy door at the far end of the corridor. She stared blankly, so he knelt again, placed her hand over his chest plate, let her feel the heartbeat. Through the armor, steady, real, human. Then he lifted the child slowly into his arms, careful not to jostle the med patch. She weighed almost nothing. The mother rose like a wounded animal, still uncertain, but something in her face shifted. Hope. Just a glimmer. That dangerous, foolish thing. They moved together through the ruins of the bay, under blinking red lights and the groans of a dying outpost. Each step forward was one away from death, but toward something terrifying, the unknown, behind them. The airlock cycled shut. The war was still out there. The blame, the fire. But for now, a soldier had answered a cry not with violence, but with presence. With a simple, reckless decision, he stayed, for 2 beings who had no one else. The crawler groaned beneath its own weight, gears grinding like old teeth as it lurched forward into the ash-choked wasteland. Dust blew in curtains across the broken plains, sweeping in through cracks in the ground like the breath of something ancient stirring below. High above, the sky smoldered a muted violet, starless and cracked with streaks of dull orange, where the atmosphere still burned in places, where human missiles had sliced too deep and alien countermeasures had torn open. The heavens, the world was not dying. It was already dead. What remained was its echo. Inside the crawler's narrow cabin, Callan sat hunched at the controls, one hand on the throttle, the other gently balancing the alien child cradled in his lap. She no longer cried, no longer whimpered, just lay there. Her small body wrapped in a patched human-filled blanket, her eyes half-lidded and silent. He could feel the warmth of her shallow breaths against the inside of his elbow. She was still alive. For now. Her mother sat across from him, her back against the rusted side wall, fingers curled tightly around the railings as the crawler bucked and swayed over ruined ground. She hadn't spoken in over an hour, not in her own language, not in his. But her eyes never left the child, and sometimes when the crawler jolted too hard, she would lean forward just enough to brush her fingers against her daughter's shoulder, as if confirming she was still real. Callan wanted to say something, anything, but the words never came out right. What could he say? That it would be okay? That he had a plan? That Earth Command would fix this? Lies all, and he had never been good at lying. So instead, he let the silence hang between them, filled only by the low hum of the crawler and the distant, constant rumble of tectonic grief from beneath the planet's fractured skin. Then, as they crossed a ridge lined with broken satellite pylons and collapsed shelters, the mother leaned forward. She opened her hand slowly, and Callan realized she was showing him something. A charm. It looked like woven strands of iridescent thread wrapped around a shard of something translucent and bone-white. A kind of locket, maybe, or a prayer token. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, hesitated, then pressed it gently against the child's blanket, tucking it close to her chest. Then she looked up at him. Her name, she said, her voice cracked and dry. Eliara. Callan blinked on it. Was the first time she had spoken since they left the base. He repeated the name softly. Eliara. The mother nodded slowly. Means light after fire. Her words were thick with accent, her grasp of English awkward, but the meaning pierced straight through the veil of silence that had hung between them. She born during attack. I ran, hid, many die. Callan adjusted his grip on the child, Eliara. Her small fingers twitched in her sleep. I was just a soldier, he said, his voice gravel low, tired. Didn't even know your kind. Had civilians down here. Command said it was a weapons cache. Hostile sector, she shook her head slowly. No weapons, just life. They rode in silence again, but it was different now. Not hollow. Just quiet like the space after a funeral prayer. Hours passed. The crawler's engine began to whine louder, warning lights blinking on the dash, fuel running dry. He tapped the screen and checked the map again. 14 miles to the outer relay. It might as well have been 100. The crawler wouldn't make it. Not unless something changed. And then she did something unexpected. The mother reached into the folds of her robes and pulled out a small crystalline cylinder, pulsing with soft blue light. It looked like a power core alien tech, barely the size of his thumb. She held it out to him. Here, energy, for machine. You use for her. Callan stared at it. You sure it'll work with our systems? She gave a half nod. I watched. Learned, before war. Her eyes glinted. Was scholar, engineer, I fix. He took it carefully and slotted it into the emergency port. The crawler stuttered, coughed, then roared to fuller life, the lights brightening. The dash lit up green. More range. More hope. He looked back at her, this alien mother who had once run from soldiers like him, who now offered the last of her people's strength to save her child and trust a human she barely knew. Not because she believed he wouldn't let her down, but because she had no choice, and somehow that trust mattered more. You were an engineer? He asked softly. She smiled weakly. Before bombs, before fire. He smiled back, just a little. I was a teacher, history. Before I wore this armor. Her eyes widened. You were builder too? Maybe, of different things. The crawler rolled on into the dusk, toward what remained of rescue or failure. Inside its metal frame rode a man who once taught ancient wars and now fought in modern ones. A mother who had once built machines of learning and now clung to fragments of her life, and a child who carried the silent hope of both. And for a moment, in that moving box of steel and memory, something unspoken passed between them. Not peace. Not yet, but something close. Something like family, asterisk. By the time the crawler crested the ridge, overlooking the old relay station, dusk had thickened into a kind of eternal twilight. The sun on this side of the planet never truly set anymore, not after the atmosphere had been scorched and torn. It hung like a ghost behind layers of drifting ash, casting no warmth, only a dull silver light that painted everything in mournful tones. The land below was cracked and cratered, pitted with the scars of orbital strikes and energy barrages. But amid that devastation, a shape still stood, a tower, half collapsed, antenna twisted like broken ribs reaching skyward. The Earthcom insignia was barely visible through the soot, a faded blue circle crumbling on its side. It had once been a beacon of safety, a fallback point. Now it was just another relic in a graveyard of intentions. Callan brought the crawler to a stop and powered it down, every movement mechanical, deliberate. Eliara stirred in his arms, her breath still shallow but steadier now, the med patch blinking in even rhythm against her skin. The mother, whose name he had still not heard, moved beside him, eyes scanning the station, calculating. She was already planning how to fix it, how to connect the systems, how to make this ruin speak again. But even before they reached the hatch, Callan's gut clenched. Something was wrong. He slung his rifle back over his shoulder and approached the structure first, instructing the mother to stay by the crawler. She obeyed reluctantly, clutching Eliara close once more. The air near the relay smelled of scorched silicon and ozone, faint but recent. The blast marks on the entry door were not from the original battle. They were fresher. Someone had been here. And not long ago. He stepped inside. The walls were streaked with smoke, wires dangling like entrails from burst conduits. A faint light pulsed from the backup systems, just enough to guide him through the corridors, his footsteps muted by ash that had drifted inside like snow. He found the command center miraculously intact and tapped into the console. His fingers flew across the surface, accessing whatever record still remained. That's when he saw it. The last transmission logs weren't outgoing distress calls or medevac requests. They were targeting data, tactical logs. And in the upper corner, stamped in blood-red encryption, was the emblem of Project Vesper. His blood ran cold. He had heard the name before, in whispers and backroom murmurs on long shuttle rides between deployments. Vesper wasn't a mission. It was a failsafe. A protocol for purging systems deemed unsalvageable, not because they were overrun by enemies, but because they were inconvenient, too politically unstable, too costly to recover. Entire settlements, human and otherwise, were reclassified as non-viable test zones. Vesper's orders were simple: use the war as cover, erase the variables. He scrolled through the logs and his jaw locked. The sector he had been deployed to? It hadn't been a battlefield by mistake. It had been a test. His unit had unknowingly been part of a controlled engagement. The aliens they were told were hostile were simply there living, rebuilding, families, engineers, children, but the command feeds had painted them as insurgents, supplied them with falsified threat signatures, even manufactured fake casualty reports of human losses to justify retaliation. Callan staggered back from the console, bile rising in his throat. His mind raced through memories, missions that hadn't made sense, targets that didn't seem right, civilians they couldn't identify because their records were corrupted. It was all fabricated. Vesper didn't care about peace. It needed conflict, for weapons data, for territorial control, for silence. He heard movement behind him and spun, weapon half raised. But it was only her. The mother had followed him inside, cradling Eliara in her arms. She saw his expression and froze. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. He stared at her. The words caught like glass in his throat. "You weren't supposed to die in crossfire," he said. "You were supposed to vanish." She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. Her eyes narrowed, not in rage, but in heartbreak. "Why?" she whispered. He shook his head, helpless. "Because someone decided your lives were inconvenient." They stood there, surrounded by blinking lights and silent machines, two beings from opposite stars, staring at the wreckage, not just of a planet, but of trust. Everything he had sworn to uphold, to defend the innocent, to bring order, to be better than the mistakes of old Earth, it had all been betrayed in the shadows of bureaucracy. He stepped forward, took a breath, and spoke the words that mattered. "Didn't know, but now I do. And I won't let it end like this." Together, they turned back toward the console. The mother leaned in beside him, setting Eliara down on a soft pile of cloth. Her hands, delicate but firm, moved across the wires, rerouting power, stabilizing the uplink. Callan fed coordinates. Into the beacon, not for evac. For exposure. They would tell the truth. Send it into the void if they had to. Let the rest of the colonies hear. Let Earth Command scramble. Let the masks fall, because humanity's strength, he realized, wasn't in its power to destroy Dot, it was in its willingness to admit the truth, and still choose to protect what mattered. Asterisk, the console sparked once, then dimmed. Outside, the air had grown heavier, darker storm clouds roiled overhead like a waking beast disturbed from slumber. The transmission had been sent. Callan could only pray it got through. The beacon was old, half-dead from decades of weather and neglect, and the uplink signal had spluttered out like a dying heartbeat as soon as they finished uploading the message. Data packets had been forced into the stream coordinates. Logs, audio, even a brief, desperate video feed showing Eliara breathing weakly in his arms while the mother's bloodied fingers reworked the cables beside her. Proof, not just of the slaughter, but of their decision to speak out. Now they could only wait. And waiting in a war zone was a kind of death in itself. Callan stepped away from the console and looked out the cracked window. The ridge they'd come over was now lost in dust and thunder, but the crawler below remained. The last remnants of their journey. It looked smaller now, its shape drowned in ash and shadow, a relic of motion that could no longer carry them further. The wind shrieked suddenly, and with it, he heard something else, an unnatural hum, low and rising, pulsing through the storm like a predator's breath. He turned, heart hammering. No, he said aloud, Dot in the distance. Just breaking the horizon. Sleek silver shapes began to descend, black and red streaks, cut across the sky like falling blades. Drones, but not salvagers. Not relief. Enforcers. Vesper had heard them. The relay had been on a ghost frequency, but even ghosts could scream loud enough if given the chance, and Vesper did not leave loose ends. Not witnesses. Not truths. The mother moved to his side, holding Eliara close again, sensing the shift. Her face had gone still, not from fear, but from a kind of resigned knowing. She looked at him, and without a word, he knew. She'd seen this before. When the world burned the first time, there's no way we outrun them, he muttered, checking. His rifle, the readout blinking red, 4 shots left. No reloads. No support. I help, she said simply, setting the child down gently onto a thermal wrap laid out by the console. Eliara didn't stir, her eyes closed, her breathing thin but stable. Then the mother turned and moved toward the broken panels near the wall, exposing the core relay wiring. What are you doing? Callan asked, stepping closer. She looked. Back at him, over her shoulder, eyes fierce, shield system. Old, but can overload. Pulse block signal jam scan. If work may confuse them, he understood. She was going to fry the relay's internal grid, forcing an energy burst that could mimic a power core overload, trick the incoming drones into thinking the station had already been destroyed, but it was a suicide move. The surge would kill anything touching the core. No, Callan said. There has to be another way. We'll hide. We'll dig in. She only smiled, a small, tragic curve of her lip. Too late. They come, and you have her. She live. If I stay, maybe you get chance. He stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. Voice rough. You're not doing this alone. But she gently pried his fingers away, her gaze soft. I'm not alone. You stay with her. That is how I live. That is enough. He wanted to scream. Wanted to pull her back, lock the doors, carry all 3 of them down into some cavern, and wait for time to forget they existed. But his heart knew what his soul already whispered. Not all acts of protection come with survival. The mother turned and began weaving the wires together, fingers moving like she was writing the last lines of a story she had never asked to be in. Callan forced himself to step away. He returned to Eliara, scooping her into his arms again. Her skin was cold, but her trust rose, steady, as if trusting that her mother's presence still lingered near. When he turned to look back, the mother raised her hand one last time, fingers open, not waving goodbye, but giving a blessing. A spark snapped. The walls lit in a bright pulse. He ducked low, clutching the child tight, shielding her body with his own. Then the storm howled. A burst of light shot from the tower's core. The blast rippled out like a shudder through the bones of the earth. And for a moment, everything went silent again. The kind of silence that follows sacrifice. Callan waited. Seconds, minutes, hours. No drones came. When the dust cleared, the sky above was empty. The relay tower still stood, but it had gone dark. Power cells drained, lights dead. And within its scorched walls, nothing moved. He stepped back into the room slowly, heart in his throat. The console was burned out, the walls scorched black. And in the center, where once wires had danced with sparks and trembling hands, there was only a smear of ash and a fragment of woven thread, its iridescent fibers catching the last dying. Light of day. Callan knelt and picked it up. It was the charm she had pressed to Eliara's chest. The symbol of her people, of her love. She had given everything for that child. He looked down at the girl in his arms. She stirred faintly, eyes flickering open. He didn't know if she understood what had happened, but he did. And in that moment, Callan Ward made a decision deeper than duty. Beyond mission parameters, he would not run. He would not forget, he would raise this child. He would carry her story, her mother's courage, their people's truth to every corner of human space. That would hear it, because humanity, for all its flaws, was capable of remembering, of changing, of honoring the brave, even if it cost them everything. Asterisk, the winds had died. The storm passed like a grieving spirit, moving on, its presence lingering only in the pale dust drifting over the dead horizon. In the hollowed-out remains of the relay station, silence reigned, not peaceful but burdened. The kind of silence that only came after someone made a final stand. The kind that left echoes long after the voice was gone. Callan stood at the precipice of what remained of the command deck. Eliara bundled tightly in the thermal wrap on his back, strapped carefully against his armor, her head resting just beneath his shoulder blades. Her weight was barely there, but her presence was a fire that would not dim. The charm her mother had once placed upon her now hung from the strap of his chest rig, a promise and a curse both. It swayed gently as he moved, catching glints of light that no longer belonged to this world. He had not expected the signal to be answered, but it had been. A sleek ship now cut through the sky above, descending fast, its hull dark with a signature matte sheen of military-grade stealth plating. It bore no flags, no insignia, but Callan recognized the profile. Vesper. They hadn't believed the relay's overloaded pulse. They had come to confirm the kill, and they would find him waiting. He descended into the open plaza outside the station, once a landing platform for medevacs and supply drops, now just a slab of scorched concrete littered with bones, some metal, some not. His rifle was in hand, loaded with the last 4 shots. No backup, no reinforcements. Just him, the girl, and the truth he refused to bury. The ship landed with mechanical grace. The dust kicked up in sharp bursts as if rejecting the arrival. Its landing ramp extended with a hiss of hydraulics, and from its shadow stepped 2 figures faceless behind mirrored visors, clad in polished armor too clean for this place. Enforcers. They didn't raise weapons. Not yet. That wasn't how Vesper operated. First came the silence, then the offer, then the quiet execution somewhere off the books, somewhere no one would ask questions. Callan stepped forward, unflinching, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "You're late." The enforcer on the left tilted his head, processing. "Sergeant Ward," came the reply, filtered through voice modulation. "You've been declared off mission. Your biotag was presumed lost. This area is a black zone. You should not be here." "I know," Callan said, not moving. "You sent the strike order. You buried the logs. You made sure no one knew what happened here." No response. Just the faint hum of the ship behind them, waiting like a coffin lid yet to close. The second enforcer stepped forward. "There is no record of hostile engagement in this region. You've been misinformed." Callan's fingers tightened around his rifle. "I was misinformed the moment I was ordered to kill civilians." A pause. Then, "Sergeant, stand down. We'll debrief you. Assess your mental state. There's a rehabilitation process for compromised assets." He barked, a laugh raw, broken. "You think I'm confused? I'm not the one covering up genocide and calling it cleanup." The first enforcer raised a hand, palm outward. "We don't want escalation." "You already escalated," he growled, and then, from behind his shoulder, Eliara whimpered soft, barely audible, the child's voice, the smallest sound in a world, full of noise, but it pierced the mask of procedure like a bullet. One of the enforcers flinched, not much, just a tilt of the head. A pause in breath, but Callan saw it. Human, beneath the mask. Maybe once a parent. Maybe once someone who believed the stories of peacekeeping, of protection. "You hear that?" Callan said, stepping forward, the charm swaying from his rig. "She's not an insurgent. She's not a threat. She's a child. Her mother died buying her one more day. You want to end this? You do it knowing exactly what it means." Still silence, his rifle raised slowly, not aimed. "Just ready. I've already transmitted the truth," he continued, voice low but clear. "Logs, footage, communications, Project Vesper's playbook. It's out there now. Even if you kill me, you're chasing shadows. People will ask questions. Someone will listen." The 2 enforcers stood still, mirrors in metal, unreadable. Then, finally, one of them spoke again. This didn't happen. Callan blinked. "What?" The enforcer stepped back. There was no contact here. Relay was non-functional. Site already abandoned. No survivors. And with that, he turned, walked up the ramp. The second followed, The ship didn't stay. No scans. No shots. No words. They left. The sky swallowed them whole. Callan stood in the silence once more, heart hammering against his ribs, breath sharp and shallow. Eliara stirred on his back, her fingers gripping the edge of his armor strap. He didn't move until the sound of the ship was completely gone. They had spared him, not because of mercy, but because the truth now carried more danger than a body count. Because they knew killing him would make a martyr. And someone, somewhere, had hesitated. Humanity. It wasn't always the heroes with flags or medals. Sometimes it was a soldier too tired to keep lying. Sometimes it was a mother who died jamming a signal. And sometimes it was the sound of a child's breath in a ruined field that made monsters retreat. Callan turned toward the mountains in the distance. There were still safe zones, still colonies untouched by the stain of Vesper. If he could get Eliara there, if she could grow, learn, speak, then the story wouldn't end here. It would begin. Asterisk, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their jagged peaks dusted in silver ash, their flanks carved by ancient winds and newer wounds. They had watched the sky burn and held their silence, towering over valleys of ruin where cities once bloomed. Now they offered only shelter, a place forgotten by satellites and command chains, a liminal space between what had been and what could still be saved. It took Callan 4 days to reach them. 4 days of walking across the broken skin of a dying planet, the child pressed close to his back, her small hands curled into his armor like roots clinging to fractured stone. He walked through acid rains and freezing winds, his boots torn open, his body ragged with pain, but he never stopped. Not when his legs buckled, not when his rations ran out, not even when his own skin split from exposure. Because every time he faltered, he would feel her heartbeat against him steady, fragile, real, and he would move again. On the 5th morning, beneath a gray sky that had not known sun in weeks, he saw the lights, faint, flickering, a beacon. Real. One dot, it came from a settlement carved into the lower cliffs, hidden behind rock formations like the curled fingers of a fist guarding a flame. They hadn't dared transmit often, not with Vesper patrols scouring the planet in the early weeks, but they had never stopped listening. And when Callan stumbled through the outer gates, face hollow and blood crusted in the corners of his mouth, they didn't ask him for a passcode or clearance. They saw the girl first, and that was enough. He collapsed in a bed that night, wrapped in old blankets that smelled like firewood and salt. Eliara slept beside him in a cot too big for her tiny frame, her breaths finally deep and easy. She had begun to speak in fragments, strange syllables, half her native tongue and half mimicry of his. Sometimes she would trace her mother's charm as she spoke. Other times she would simply stare at him with eyes too wise for her age, as if remembering things too large for a child's heart. Weeks passed. Then months. The settlement grew more vibrant with spring. People returned to the world in cautious trickles, scientists, builders, those who had refused to believe in easy narratives. The transmission Callan had sent had not brought justice. Not yet, but it had sown doubt, whispers, investigations, a few resignations in distant corners of Earth Command. A quiet panic behind closed doors. The kind that meant the story had struck somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Callan became something of a ghost in the village, never boasting, never speaking of the war unless asked. He spent his days teaching Eliara to walk barefoot on the stone paths, to trace star maps on the ceilings of the caves. He taught her old Earth lullabies and sat with her through the nights she woke screaming with her mother's name on her lips. He never corrected her, never told her it was a dream, because grief wasn't something you erased. It was something you learned to carry. One night, after watching the stars return to the sky for the first time since the fires, she reached up and touched his cheek. "Home?" she asked in the patchwork language they had made together. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded. Double quotes, yes, he said softly. Home. And in that word lived the weight of everything they had survived. The relay tower, the enforcers, the storm of ash and silence, the last stand of a mother who had died so her daughter could live. Humanity had not saved the universe with a weapon. It had not won the day with numbers or brute force. It had saved one life, made one choice, and that choice echoed. One soldier had stayed behind. One woman had given everything. One child had learned that sometimes love comes in the shape of a stranger's arms. In the years that followed, Eliara would grow. She would speak in 2 tongues, then 3. She would become a symbol, not of war, but of something more terrifying to those in power: unity. She would tell the story of her mother not as a victim, but as a warrior who wielded empathy like a blade. And she would speak of the human who, had carried her through the end of the world, not because he was told to, but because he could not imagine doing otherwise, and the charm she wore around her neck, threaded with new strands of copper and glass, would glow faintly every time she told the story of a planet burned, of a promise made, of a humanity that, at its best, did not run from sorrow, but walked beside it through fire until something better was born.